Africa. They're not going to introduce themselves as people, and then I'll start. Is that okay?
Okay, I think I see Jeremy there as well as Peter. Yes, hi Jeremy.
Okay. And then everyone else will see just now.
Okay, a familiar scene.
But we can't see you, we're only...
He's close.
Oh, it's close.
Very blurry, but I can see there are real people there, yeah.
Don't they need to switch up those lights above the screen?
Okay, let's start. First, welcome everyone to this book launch, a very exciting book launch of a book titled Conversations with Bourdieu, the Johannesburg Moment. The book is co-authored by Professor Michael Bourdieu, the Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also current president of ISA, the International Sociological Association. Joining us via Skype. The second author is none other than a very old Professor Calvin Holt, also a sociologist and director of SWAP, a research institute here at Berkeley. Then we also take this opportunity to introduce our two speakers, Professor Peter Alexander from the university down the road that we prefer not to talk about, the University of Johannesburg, and Professor Jeremy Sippings here from the University in that problematic province, the University of Cape Town. Peter and Jeremy will each have 10 minutes to do a song and dance for the book. No. They'll say a few things about the book and possibly raise questions that Michael and Carl will respond to, and then we'll give you an opportunity to say a couple of things, raise questions, or even comments. For all of us in this room, I think all of us have read the book already. But maybe first, allow me to say a couple of things about the book and how it came about. This book launch and the book is a special moment for some in this room, but also others elsewhere. I think there are many reasons why it's special, but let me just mention, I think, 2 or 3 of them. First, I think the book captures the many conversations that took place through a series of seminar lectures that took place in this very room on this campus many years ago, and I'll talk about that just now. These seminars were led by Michael and included vet academics, students from different departments in this faculty, but also individuals in other faculties in this university. But also, most importantly, the seminars also included individuals from other universities and other organizations. So we had conversations with internal discussions amongst various academics and students, but also interactions and discussions with other individuals from other organizations, but also institutions that UJ being one of them. So I think this book launch is happening in this particular place. I think it's no coincidence that it's happening in this very same room. But also it's no coincidence that it's also happening, I think I want to emphasize this issue around place, in Johannesburg, at Wits University, in South Africa, but also importantly at a particular time, and this leads me to the second point, that the timing of the seminar is also significant. The seminars and many of these conversations that are captured in the book took place in 2010, the year of the World Cup. Remember the World Cup? So while the world and some of our colleagues here and elsewhere were fixated in discussing matters related to the football field, asking questions such as, is South Africa ready to host the World Cup? Will the various stadia be ready in time? Who will win the World Cup? But even better, our colleagues were also asking, what is the legacy of the World Cup for South Africa and even for Africa? Well, you know what happened there. Other people, some in this room, were asking questions and having discussions about a different field, right? Different field. We were talking about Karl Marx, Bourdieu, and admittedly, sorry, Karl and Michael, we were asking, some of us were asking, what was the relevance of such theories in South Africa? And we actually preferred talking about Karl Marx. We related more to Karl Marx. We wanted that discussion around Karl Marx to continue. The conversations during and after these seminars were fantastic, were phenomenal. And this book that has been launched today, that we, all of us are launching, captures and continues the 2010 Johannesburg moment. The discussions, and hopefully some of these discussions, some of the new discussions will be made out of today, but continue beyond the lifespan of even this book. So, let's continue the discussion, and then we hand over the mic to first Peter or Jeremy. Peter, you have 10 minutes, don't forget the song and dance.
Song and dance. Okay, well, let me act in solidarity with Michael first of all, and wave my arms a bit. Then act in solidarity with Karl and sit down. My own contact with Pierre Bourdieu was, I must say, limited and one-sided. I once wrote him a letter on behalf of the South African Sociological Association, inviting him to speak at a conference in South Africa. The letter was acknowledged by one of his secretaries, so it was received in Paris, but then there was silence. Pierre Bourdieu didn't come to South Africa. So I want to begin by thanking Michael, because as you put it yourself at one point, you have brought Pierre Bourdieu to South Africa. You did what I couldn't do. You provided Pierre Bourdieu for us to engage in a debate with. And of course, Karl has provided our response, or one of our responses to Pierre Bourdieu. I think it is a work of brilliance. The way I understand brilliance as something personal is that it gives me a slight coldness down my spine. It's a very visceral experience, and certainly that's what this book did for me. The mere idea of trying to develop a conversation between Pierre Bourdieu and various other people is really quite amazing. To put it into practice and to do it so marvellously, so beautiful, is something that I think we must all appreciate and thank Michael for. To add to that, Karl's own reading, not just of Bourdieu, of Michael's comments, but of the South African situation, is something which raises the whole conversation to a new level. Perhaps what I could do is to pose a question to Michael and to Karl, which is, can you raise it to yet another level? How does your experience, your understanding of this conversation between each other help you, Michael, to understand Bourdieu within an international context? I think it's very important indeed that we think about Bourdieu, the concepts which he's used, in a South African concept and work out whether they're useful or not useful. But you've now produced a book. I've got one criticism of the book. It's that it's published by Wits University Press. Not for the obvious reason that Sarah might hint at, but because what I would like is to see it being published by the University of California Press and Wits University Press. In other words, it's a book which ought to have a wider audience internationally. But if it would have that audience, what would its relevance be to somebody in Paris or San Francisco or somewhere else in the world who might be reading it? Now let me just suggest one angle. I have to keep this short because I'm worried about the violence that Sarah might do to me, symbolic or otherwise, if I were to speak for too long. I want to raise again one of the themes that ran through the discussions, and that is the issue of habitus. To what extent is it a useful concept in South Africa or indeed anywhere else in the world today? The argument in favour runs like this, that we need a concept which, taking us beyond the notion of hegemony, conveys a way in which we interiorise and reproduce our own oppression. The argument against is that the concept does not and cannot explain social change. The way in which, despite class habitus, people engage in struggles, sometimes undertaking this by means of an alternative worldview. and sometimes successfully. To be put it bluntly, the problem with habitats is that whilst it might explain the durability of apartheid, it doesn't help us to explain the ending of apartheid. Now let's see what our authors have to say about this as a way of opening up discussion on this key concept. Carl's view is in the end says, finally, I'm not sure that the inability of habitats to explain social change is sufficient reason to abandon the concept altogether. As Michael concludes, he says. Then how does Michael conclude? He says as follows. He says, the concept of habitus may be necessary. Okay, it's not rejected completely. It may be necessary, but it has to be revamped if it is to explain the abiding struggles of the South African working class. So you disagree with each other, which is a good thing. That's what conversations are about. And it seems to me that it does have some value, but does need to be revamped. But if it's going to be revamped, and one way in which you suggest this can be done is to talk about a habitus of defiance, a very useful and interesting formulation. I think the way in which some other people put it was echoing Gramsci, to talk about some kind of contradictory habitus. But if that's to be done, then how do we do it? I mean, the questions are left up in the air at the end of the book, very interestingly, for continued debate, and maybe that is something we can be discussing. Now, I don't want to say nice things, partly because I will suffer as a consequence if I spend time doing that. But let me explain my annoyance with the book. Because although I'm very pleased that Carl should be speaking on our behalf of South Africans in response to Michael and to Bourdieu, there are inevitably, as there would be for anybody, passages which one doesn't really go along with. And my own problem is the parody of Marxists, what one finds in the book under Carl's signature. He complains about the way in which we use terms like state, class, capitalism, and so on. Now, it seems to me that these are words in common usage by sociologists generally. It's not just about Marxists. Indeed, Michael and, of course, Carl use these words themselves in the presentation of their ideas. It's a bit difficult to avoid doing so. Carl complains about the way in which Marxists, never named, talk about neoliberalism, complain about neoliberalism. Of course, neoliberalism was a concept which Bourdieu used frequently and to good effect, it seems to me personally, that it's rather dated and doesn't really help us to understand South Africa today, but that's by the by. What I'm interested in here is in particular the issue of class and the way in which class is used, because one of Carl's strong arguments is that we need to be thinking critically about these concepts. We need to be able to root them in our own experience. We need to be able to assess whether these concepts are useful and whether perhaps they need to be modified. And it seems to me there's an argument here in particular for trying to think about what class means in a South African context. Obviously, the idea of classification is central to Bourdieu's own thinking about the way in which class operates. We classify people and in that way create some notion of class. One of the most interesting pieces of work that I've seen recently was by a colleague, or a couple of colleagues of mine, who were looking at the way in which the concept of class is understood, or indeed misunderstood, in terms of its use in various African languages, where there's no direct equivalent for a concept like middle class. And so the understanding that people give to middle class is not the same as the understanding you get from sociological textbooks or from Marxists or anything of the sort. I mean, something much more equivalent to the notion of middling, people who are in the middle. Now, it seems to me that that's the kind of way we should be approaching these things, not just simply saying that class is not a useful concept and Marxists are wrong to use it, but to recognise that some Marxists are trying to understand these terms in relation to South Africa and in relation to the different kinds of languages that are being used in South Africa. But it does seem to me that this attack on Marxists is one which is inappropriate. I don't want to defend intellectuals in any way at all. I didn't want to debate the use of class by various people. But the suggestion that Marxists are not alive to the ambiguities and complexities and so on of these concepts seems to me to be very unfair on those Marxists who are active in townships, who are having to grapple with some of these ambiguities and complexities every day. I mean, how do you cope with situations where, on the one hand, you want to encourage some sense of working class unity, and on the other hand, are confronted with the realities of xenophobia, attacks on foreigners, sometimes by people who you're quite close to? How do you cope with the reality of the situation where you want to encourage some kind of organised struggle, but are confronted with the reality of anger, sheer anger of people, in perhaps attacking a councillor who you know is perhaps corrupt. These are regular day-in-day problems, which the complexity of which is being handled by people on the ground. And the leadership class, it seems to me, is important in another way. Carl suggests that some people are so concerned to show that there's a class movement that they override all these kind of complexities. My suggestion would be that Carl is so concerned to demonstrate the movement of people into new classes that he also elides ambiguities, complexities, and so on. His argument is that we're experiencing a period of new class formation. There are new classes being formed, a black middle class, a black elite, and so on and so forth. Now, this may be true. When I first heard the argument, I was more or less convinced, but I hope you can perhaps convince now Marxists. How would you convince a Marxist of this argument? And how would you do so? Using some facts. Because in the book, one of the things that's missing in terms of this argument is facts to support the argument. It's not just that there's ambiguities, it's also there's some evidence. So I'm raising this part in order to give you an opportunity to convince me and to convince others about this important argument. You may be right, I'm not suggesting that you're wrong, but I'd like to see the evidence put before us. Right. Let me now quote from Bourdieu, because it ties together a couple of the themes that I put out. It's one of my favourite quotes from Distinction. And what Bourdieu argues is that social class is not defined solely, an important word here, okay, solely. Social class is not defined solely, in other words, not only, but largely, by its position in relation to the means of production, but also by the class habitus, which is normally, i.e. with a high statistical probability, associated with the position. In other words, and we can forget this in reading Bourdieu for a reason which I'll come back to, Bourdieu's own argument is rooted in material relations, in the relations of production. And that's how he understands class. Of course, it has all sorts of associations with habitus and so on, but it's rooted in means of production. And the reason I raise this is twofold. Firstly, it seems to me that from a Bourdieuian position, one would have to, if one's going to argue for the development of a new class, have to think about relations to production, as well as thinking about the questions of habitus, of associations and so on, which seems to be the thinking behind the idea of there being a new black middle class elite and so on and so forth. The other reason I raise this is because if one were to try to think about how we get back to the idea of a contradictory habitus, or a habitus of defiance, then how are we going to think that through in terms of how it might arise? How do we get to a position where rather than there simply being this notion of habitus, which is rather conservative, holds us back from doing things, we move to a situation where habitus can also be, in some sense, liberating. And I don't think one can do that without bringing in the question of some kind of sense of material relations, conflicts over interests and so on and so forth. Now the argument about habitus is not developed in the book, so I'm wondering if you might now like to use this opportunity to think about the question of habitus of defiance and the way in which to think that through. One has to go on to raise and bring to the fore a point that you might is worse. Poverty is worse than it was under apartheid. And these are the things that we need to take on board, not in terms just simply of trying to unpack the details, which Carl is absolutely superb at, but in trying to understand what might happen in the future and trying to think about the way in which the future might be shaped by ideas and by organisation and so on. Now clearly there are some other differences which are positive. There's a whole social welfare system which has been developed, which Jeremy in particular has written about. And somehow, I think as social activists and social theorists today, we have to work out the relationship between these two things. And I think Bourdieu may be of some value here. You know, he talks about the left hand and the right hand of the state. How do these two things work and how are they affected by the variety of different pressures that we've discussed? But I do think if we're going to talk about violence as part of this media, a range of different things that we have to take on board, then we have to break it down. One of my criticisms of Carl, we debated it before, and I'm loath to say anything now, is the tendency to compress different kinds of violence into one category.
And I agree very much with what Dimitri was saying. The question is whose violence? Because whose violence is also related to the extent of violence, the sheer brutality of the violence that's involved. And here I do want to kind of urge people to read Sarah's book, because she's got this harrowing detail in it of young people who use violence against their grandparents, usually their grandmothers, just in order to get some of the resources from their pension. Now, how do we understand this? How do we interpret this? This is violence, in a sense, subordinate violence between ordinary poor people. But if we're to understand it, we have to start by talking about the violence of poverty that people live in. Why should people be in a situation where they're dependent upon pensions? Why should we have young men, young women who've got no resources whatsoever that they can make use of, unless they can rob their grandparents? So I think we need to situate this violence, Carl, in a much larger framework and understand the different kinds of violence that exist in our society.
Thanks, Peter. We are concluding this session with concluding remarks from, starting with Mark and then Carl. Carl will give his 1 minute to Michael. Michael, you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. All right. Well, first, this question of violence, I have nothing to say about it, but basically I think it's very important. So I think this formulation of the different types of violence, I think that's exactly the way to go. And I think Bourdieu offers us very little, and Fanon offers much more. As to this, I think Bourdieu has a theory of social change. He basically has a theory of social order, in which I disagree with Jeremy, in which, in fact, dominated cannot understand the conditions of the domination because they are so absorbed in their material life. He has openings, possibility of change. When habitus feel clash, for example, when habitus is internally contradictory, he has the possibility of change, but not the theory of change. He has no theory of the consequences of clash in habitus and field. So I think there's an area there for Jeremy to develop. And also, I look forward to conversations, from any conversation with Bourdieu. That is the fascination of Bourdieu. And in fact, have a conversation, or any theorist can have a conversation with Bourdieu. I don't know how it's possible, but his opus lends itself to multiple conversations. The one person with this, Jeremy, is Durkheim. He is first and foremost a Durkheimian, in my view. And most of his ideas of symbolic domination come from Durkheim. Let me say one thing about Weber. I have to say this because he's not a Weber in one page, and he's explicit about this. His critique of Weber, basically, Weber doesn't understand the recognition. But basically, he hasn't a concept even of false consciousness. That you can read Scout's Meditation, I've been looking at here, read it. And that's what he said about Weber on 210. And basically, speak of the idea of legislature. That's the advantage of being at home in front of my books.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let me end with what I was supposed to start with and congratulate both Michael and Carl for producing something very outstanding. It's produced by Wits Press, and therefore Wits Press will have the last say.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The book is available at the back. Some of you have already bought a copy or copies. It goes for 200 rands. It's selling for 200 rands tonight. Tomorrow morning from 8 o'clock, it will be 250. We are that capitalist at Wits University Press. So, if you bought a copy earlier, if you don't mind, if you use your credit card, if you could pass by our desk there, we need some details from your card. And I think there's still a few drinks left at the back. Enjoy yourself. Good evening.